Hi there, welcome to Creative Writing Corner. I'm Luke J. Morris, and today we're talking about writing actions. Not talking about writing action as in action scenes, because in a sense, everything you write is going to be action. So we are first going to define what an action is, and then we are going to move on to see how we write them. How do we create them? So our lesson today comes from this book right here, Backwards and Forwards by David Ball. This is the first book that I was assigned to read in my playwriting class that I took back in college. It was actually the only creative writing class that my undergraduate, my small liberal arts college, offered. I took all the writing classes offered, including a class in advanced composition and a class in prose style, and this class was actually a theater class in playwriting. So this is Backwards and Forwards, a technical manual for reading plays. Yes, I was assigned this in a playwriting class, and now when I'm teaching my own creative writing classes, we do a playwriting unit, and I assign this at the beginning of the playwriting unit. But I don't think it's just applicable to playwriting. I think that this type of, the lesson that I'm going to cover today is applicable to all forms of storytelling, whether you're writing plays, screenplays, comics, graphic novels, short stories, or novels. Any kind of storytelling you're doing, this is going to be applicable to that. So, let's talk about what an action is. A play is a series of actions. This is very important, and this applies not just to plays, but to stories. So, Ball is defining a play as a series of actions. So what is an action? Action occurs when something happens that makes or permits something else to happen. Action is two something happenings, one leading to another. So one thing happening is not an action, not as defined by David Ball, not as defined in terms of a play script, and not really as defined in terms of any kind of story. And we're going to see why in a little bit as we move on with this. But an action is two something happenings. One thing happens that causes another thing to happen. So, the core question you have to ask is, what happens that makes something else happen? Right? What is the thing that causes the next thing to happen? So, this is a good tool to use when you're thinking about drafting, when you're thinking about what to write. You need to think about how all your scenes connect with each other. What could this scene that you just wrote cause to happen in the next scene? Or it doesn't even have to be scene to scene. It can be beat to beat within the same scene. What causes this thing to happen? Or what can this thing cause in the next scene? When you're drafting, when you are revising is when this tool really comes into play, though. When you're revising as a playwright or a writer, a storyteller of any kind, that's when you're really going to apply this and see if every action is completed. One event requires a second event connected. In life and on stage, unconnected events are irrelevant. So if you have a whole bunch of unconnected events, a whole bunch of things that happen, well, Seinfeld made a whole career out of that, right? This whole show is about nothing happening, but each individual episode, or even sometimes a series of episodes, would continue a story. You'd have the basic starting point, the middle, and an end. Every single one of those followed the rules of story and set up and paid off what it set up. So this is the rule of setup and payoff, right? It's just a different way of describing it. The rule of setup and payoff, which is the rule of storytelling. You must set up what you pay off, and you must pay off what you set up. Otherwise, you have incomplete actions. A series of incomplete actions, you just have a bunch of setups with no payoffs, is very unsatisfying for a reader. If you have a bunch of payoffs with no setups, also very unsatisfying for a reader. Yes, you can do this if you want to write experimental fiction or tell experimental stories, or just in general be avant-garde or question the very nature of art and of story. You can by all means go that route and be as literary as you want to be. I will lose my English teacher card if I said that you couldn't. You absolutely can. You can do anything you want in writing. That's one of the great things about it, is that there are no rules. You have absolute freedom. But that's also one of the hard parts, is having such absolute freedom. How can you make sure that you're communicating anything of value? If all you're doing is just plopping down a whole bunch of unconnected scenes, sure, some writers, the 1%, have managed to make a career off of doing things that go against the grain, about questioning the very nature of art and literature and story. People like James Joyce and Virginia Woolf have challenged the very conception of the story and given us new ideas for how to arrange things. That's great. If you want to be the one to do that, that's fine. But for every James Joyce, for every one James Joyce out there, there are 1,000 or 100,000 wannabe James Joyces who end up basically saying nothing and just connecting a whole bunch of nonsense together. So this is me on my soapbox here, but speaking as both a writer and an English teacher, I can say pretty confidently that you should be basically trying to tell the stories that best connect with you. So if you read nothing but James Joyce and Virginia Woolf, and that's the kind of stuff you want to write, by all means write that. But if you want to tell stories that tend to resonate with readers and that other people want to read, or other people want to hear, or other people want to see, then chances are you are trying to make your storytelling better in that sense, in that more objective or universal sense. Maybe not in a truly objective, ephemeral sense, but at least more accessible to more people. You want to communicate, so you want people to read your writing and enjoy it, right? You want to be able to say something to them. So, you must connect these events. Unconnected events are irrelevant. Events that don't connect to anything, they're called non sequiturs for a reason. They can be pretty good for comedy, but otherwise, there's no purpose to them. If I fire a gun at you and you fall over in a dead heap, then we have an action. If I fire a gun at you and nothing happens, well then it could be considered an action if I miss. But if I fire a gun at you, the bullet hits you, and you do not fall over at all, there's no reaction whatsoever, then it's not an action, right? If I fire the gun and the scene ends there, we have no action. Sometimes that can be a decent way to end a scene, to leave the actual ending of the scene unknown so that the reader must read on to figure out what actually happened. That's fine, but eventually the payoff has to come, right? We have to have that falling over in a dead heap. Not every action needs to be so connected. The first event does not need to be directly chronologically connected to the second event so that they immediately happen back to back. But what you set up, you should pay off. In other words, an event is anything that happens. An action is two connected events. Event 1 is called the trigger, then I fire the gun at you. Event 2 is called the heap. You fall over in the heap, right? So this guy shoots this guy and he falls over, right? Two events, trigger and heap. Trigger and heap. Instant by instant, moment by moment, from start to finish, the playwright crafts a series of actions. Trigger and heap, trigger and heap. Okay, so this is that setup and payoff that I've talked about before. Setup, payoff, throughout the story. And the whole story itself is a bigger setup and payoff, right? The very core conflict is a setup and a payoff. But within that story, each event causes or permits a second event. That is one action. But now the heap, the second event, becomes a trigger, a new first event of a new action. Say, I pull the trigger, person falls over in a heap, that triggers me to run away because the action of that trigger also triggered another heap of causing the police to come. So we hear the siren. The siren causes me to run away. So that sound of the gun firing killed the person. The person falls down. But the sound of the gun also triggered the police to get called. So now the sound of the siren on its way triggers me as the killer to run away. I'm not the killer, by the way. But if I were, this is all about storytelling, right? So the police siren's going off. That triggers me to run away. Also triggers me to get rid of the gun in a panic. And, that triggers the next thing, and the next thing, and the next thing. Each new heap becomes a trigger of the next new action until we're at the very end of the story. So a play is like a series of dominoes in this way. One event triggers the next, and so on. Ba, 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 ba. And the key here is adjacent dominoes. It's finding the adjacent domino in the story. It does not have to be adjacent to it within the text, but in terms of consequence, in terms of cause and effect, there must be an adjacent domino somewhere in the text that ties into it, right? The key is adjacent dominoes, the collision of each domino into the one right next to it. If you cannot find the connection between one domino and the next, why or how one makes the next fall, then there is a problem. This is a problem either in, if you are just reading someone else's story and you can't find the connection, it's a problem either in your reading or your writing. So if you are looking back over your own story here and you can't figure out the action that caused, or the event that caused the next event to happen, if you can't figure out the trigger for a heap, or you can't figure out the heap that follows a certain trigger, then you have a problem. Then you've recognized this is what a plot hole is, right? You've recognized a hole in your story. This is part of the problem. And so that's going to give you a good guide for what you need to fix. Sequential analysis means following the play or any story domino by domino from start to finish. So as you're drafting, that's kind of what you want to do. But of course, when you're drafting, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to come up with new things. You're going to come up with new ideas. You're going to go in different directions. We've talked about what the first draft of everything is. It's not good, right? The first draft is the opposite of good. The first draft is the down draft. It's getting the ideas down. It's the second draft where you clean everything up, it's the up draft. It's where you make it a more presentable idea, right? Where you make things cohere. Okay, and that's where you put the dominoes together, is in that second draft. That's where the sequential analysis comes in. And when you're doing sequential analysis, David Ball recommends you do it backwards. Again, backwards and forwards is what this is about. And it's a manual for reading plays. It's also one of the best play writing, or writing books in general, that I've read. It's a very short one, but I highly recommend every writer read this one. Especially when you're doing rewriting. I think this idea of actions, revising and rewriting, really comes into play, because when he says going forward allows unpredictable possibility, going backwards exposes that which is required. So going forwards, as you're drafting, allows that unpredictable possibility to come up. Each trigger can lead to half a dozen new heaps, right? Each trigger can have a whole bunch of different possible outcomes. That's the freedom that you have when you're drafting, when you're writing. Even if you've planned out and plotted out and outlined or mapped out your story beforehand, still each step gives you unlimited possibilities there. But going backwards exposes that which is required. Well, if we are going to get to this, if this is going to be a resolution, what needs to happen at the climax? If this is going to be the climax, what needs to happen right before that? If this is going to be the trigger for the climax, what is going to be the rising action that leads to that trigger? What does that trigger the heap to? All the way back to the inciting incident, and what causes the inciting incident to come about to throw the hero from his status quo world into the story world. Using some technical storytelling language here, but hopefully you're a little bit familiar with this. If not, look at some of my other videos to talk through all of this stuff. But yeah, when you are revising, when you're going through revising, go backwards through your script and see what sets up each step. What is the trigger for each new heap? How are the dominoes connected? And where are the dominoes not connected? You're going to find unconnected dominoes. I guarantee you. Every draft I've written, I've found unconnected dominoes. And that's in drafts of short stories as well as full-length novels. And every draft I've read, and I'm including drafts, I've read a lot of other writers' drafts because I've been teaching writing for years. And I also went through graduate school in creative writing where me and my peers critiqued each other. Right? So I've read hundreds of drafts. And I've seen so many of them come through. And as an independent writer, I can pick out the holes in someone else's draft. But this is also something that you want to do for yourself, especially with your very first rough draft. Because you don't necessarily want to see anyone else to see your rough draft. You want to go through and find the big gaping problems first. So go backwards from your resolution to your climax and all the way back down to your status quo situation, right, prior to the inciting incident, all the way backwards through your story, and see where does each domino fall? How can you make them connect? An action is not a single thing happening. An action is always two things happening. Start looking for incomplete actions. That is, heaps that had no trigger, triggers that have no heap, right? Setups that have no payoff, payoffs that have no setup. You're going to start looking for this in your own writing, and also start looking for it in the stories that you read and that you view, right? Where are the triggers, where are the heaps, and where are the missing pieces? You develop a good eye for this, a good ear for this. You're going to be applying it better to your writing on an ongoing basis, and it's going to make your stories that much better and much more satisfying to read and view. So, guys, go out there, start writing some actions. I'm looking forward to seeing what you come up with. And until next time, please make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any writing tips and tips. Tips and tricks is what I was going for, but you know what I'm saying. So make sure to subscribe to the channel, please. It really helps me out as an independent creator as well. Hit the little bell notification button so you make sure you get notified, and like the video. Also, if you are interested in writing a new story, you don't have any ideas, I've got a whole little short booklet, guidebook on creating characters for stories that are already ready set to go into your stories. And it's a good exercise book, I think, for getting you started on writing anything from a flash fiction story to a full-length novel. And that is for free, so go ahead and click on the link in the description below and enjoy that. Let me know how it helps you, and let me know what actions you recognize in your own writing or reading that you've done or movies that you've seen. Where do you recognize actions? Where do you recognize incomplete actions? Love to hear from it. All right, guys, good luck. Talk to you next time. Peace.